Shalom from Jerusalem. I'm Jonathan Lipnick from eTeacher Biblical, and I'm standing on a rooftop in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem overlooking the Temple Mount. The Gospels tell us that each day that Jesus was in Jerusalem, he would walk down from the Mount of Olives where he was staying with Mary and Martha and teach in the courtyards which surrounded the temple. One of the things that he does during this week is violate the status quo, so to speak, by overturning the tables of the money changers. This was an act of rebellion, which got him in a lot of trouble and really begins the process which culminates on Good Friday with his crucifixion. Let's take a closer look.
Unfortunately, the Gospels do not contain much concrete information about the first half of Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. Luke 19:47 tells us very briefly that every day he was teaching in the temple. Presumably, the area where Jesus taught was the royal stoa, a covered porch on the southern part of the Temple Mount. One of the few things we know that Jesus did during these days in the royal stoa is a public disturbance known as the cleansing of the temple. Mark tells us he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Many people assume that Jesus' disruption was motivated by an opposition to the temple itself and its system of sacrifices. This is not likely. In order to understand the true meaning of Jesus' action, we need to examine closely the words he used and the site where this took place. The temple that Jesus entered when he came to Jerusalem in the year 30 had recently been renovated by Herod the Great. Herod spent huge sums of money to totally refurbish the Second Temple. Most notably, he created a massive 35-acre platform on top of Mount Moriah, which was held up by a series of retaining walls. This sacred esplanade is what we see on the Temple Mount today. The space was organized concentrically into several rings, the inner circle reserved for priests, the middle circle for Jews, and the outer circle for the Gentiles. This outer layer, known as the court of the Gentiles, was a popular place for public gatherings because it was the only place where non-Jews were permitted on the Temple Mount. Likely, Jesus taught in the shade of the royal stoa, which was located at the southern edge of this courtyard. The trouble is that vendors had also set up shop in the court of the Gentiles. Jesus is angry at the temple authorities for converting this Gentile area into a den of robbers, nothing more than a shady bazaar. He's outraged that the temple is not fulfilling its mission to be a universal place of pilgrimage, and this is precisely the reason he chooses to quote Isaiah 56:7. "These I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." The final phrase in Hebrew is "Ki veiti beit tefillah yikare lechol ha'amim." The word amim, which means nations or peoples in Hebrew, was translated into Greek as ethne. Sometimes this gets translated into English as Gentiles, which means non-Jews. But in fact, the original meaning of the word Gentiles is simply the peoples or the nations. So the court of the Gentiles, where Jesus was teaching, and where the money changers were doing business, is the court of all nations. This was the one part of Herod's temple that in fact was fulfilling Isaiah's vision of universalism. In Matthew's and Luke's accounts of the cleansing of the temple, Jesus says simply, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer," omitting the end of the verse. Only Mark quotes the Isaiah verse completely, adding, "for all the nations." For Mark, it is crucial to emphasize that this disturbance is happening in the court of the Gentiles. Because for Mark, the earliest of our four Gospels, Jesus' cleansing of the temple is not intended to purge the temple of its commercial basis, but to restore the atmosphere of solemnity to the parts of the temple that are reserved for all the nations. This is a sample of how reading the Bible in the original Hebrew and Greek has the power to transform your understanding of the Scriptures. Please click here to learn more about eTeacher's live online biblical language courses. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to click like and to comment below. I hope you'll join me on the next episode as I continue to explore the final week of Jesus in Jerusalem.